Okay, so now we're going to dive into the third section of sort of this historical and theoretical component before we get into the visual analysis exercise. So that's how race intersects with the business of fashion. So I'll be talking about some histories of misrepresentation and cultural appropriation. This is Christian Louboutin's nude shoe line, one of them. Nude is not a color, it's a concept, he says. So this is just showing the full spectrum. We're also seeing undergarment lines, like lingerie now being presented in a full spectrum of colors that explore nude in various ways. Nude as it aligns with the actual skin tone color spectrum. So one history I want to talk about is Orientalism. And so I have a couple of images here. This drawing here, this is sort of your typical sort of European or maybe British family visiting India. And in every way imaginable in this image, you're seeing colonizing at work. And what I mean by that is just sort of in the way we can dissect this image. You have the family, first of all. They're sitting in the center of the image, just kind of enjoying the good life. You have the man here with his legs crossed and his head back, just relaxing. You have an Indian man here, just kind of serving beverages to them. The wife is just kind of reading, and the child playing with the garments of these people. He's kind of like playing with this headcloth and letting it just kind of fall down his face, and he's got a drum at his feet. So they're just kind of playing with all these objects that they've dominated now in this image. And they're also kind of showing a conquering over nature. They're sitting on top of this animal skin rug. So they're just colonizing and overpowering everything, and it's a powerful image because it's showing how they overtake this. You also have someone here in the back nurturing one of the infants, one of their other babies. So they're kind of being served in every way in this image and dominating. And then you have a man here fanning them to keep them comfortable. So it's just a whole kind of montage of privilege here that we're seeing. So just kind of thinking about this definition of Orientalism and the Orientalist objective here, I pull from Richard Martin and Harold Coda, who had an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was quite similar to China Through the Looking Glass that just happened a few years ago. They did an exhibition in 1994 that explored the influence of Asian culture on Western designers. And so they say the Orientalist objective in Western dress was to cull from the various Easts that spellbinding foreignness for the purposes of rendering Western dress richer and more exotic. These are words that we often see thrown around, where they may feel a little bit bland or that they're lacking a little something. And so you have Eastern dress providing this antidote, this way of just sort of adding richness, beauty, splendor, vibrance to a collection. One designer who's very popular in doing this is Paul Poiret. He was known for his 1,002nd Night party. And this piece is from 1911, where he would pull harem pants or have these sort of tunics or lampshade dresses that all kind of pulled from Eastern dress, but sort of reimagined it in a different way. You see the jewels and the turbans that he would pull from. So he was kind of one of the key designers who was always kind of drawing upon the East for his collection influence. Africanisme, that's another thing that I talk about in my fashion and race class. So where we have Orientalism, where it's drawing from the East, the broad East, so any Asian culture. You also had this time period in the early 20th century, specifically in the 1920s and 19-teens, where you have designers, art dealers, musicians all drawing upon all things African during this time to embody coolness and add to this sort of exoticism or richness to their work. And so there's a great book called Negrophilia by the late scholar Bertrine Archer Straw. I used her actually through my undergrad work and through my grad work. It's a book from it's a book that talks about 1920s avant-garde Paris and how kind of the hipsters who were living during that time would always draw upon Black and African art, from the music to the bangles, the art, everything, just to kind of embody this sense of coolness, to get a taste of coolness. And so in kind of exploring Blackness as a vehicle for modernity or coolness, so the irony in that first you had Blacks trying to embody modernity, but just couldn't, or were always constantly lampooned, or their efforts were sabotaged through illustrations like William Edward Clay, who just made them seem, you're never going to be civilized, you're never going to be modern. Patrine Archer-Straw kind of proposes to you that modernity in the early 20th century is actually seen through and on the backs of people of color. So with modernity embodying coolness and fashion, if you will, these new ways of expressing themselves, this was seen through Black identity. And so how does this come about and why? So Africa during this time, from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, it's seen as this sort of lush and nourishing refuge from for the interwar period. So by the when World War I starts, by the 19-teens, when you have these times of social turmoil, political tension, or people who just want to resist the status quo or the norm, a great way to escape is through a culture that is not your own. And so this was seen through, in some ways, Asian culture, but especially here, African culture. So when you're dealing with people who are maybe feeling that through industrialization, things are becoming a little too modern, a little too mechanized, or maybe a little too stiff. One way to kind of escape and enjoy new ways of expressing yourself can be seen through African culture, as broad as it is. So when things seem over-industrialized, you have these people looking for something that's the exact opposite of that, something that's a little more primitive, that feels like you're going back to nature. It's this great way of escaping. You also see the kind of wearing by the 19th century of sandals and things like that, because it embodied a sense of freedom, being able to wear your feet in an exposed way. It was very opposite to kind of the typical European way of wearing shoes. So again, the takeaway here is this sort of escapism that can be found through the other, using the other to explore new ways of escaping the reality that you're in. Another thing that comes out of this is this idea of the noble savage. So you see this homogenization of Black identity and appearance, and seeing Black people as kind of primitive, but sort of docile through the noble savage. So this person that is not in a place of power, almost like a eunuch. And so then you also have African art, style, and performance as a way of rejecting traditional values. Again, coming back to what I was just saying of how immersing yourself in African style and African culture, it's this way of escaping the status quo or traditional values, maybe going against what your parents are saying or doing during this time. So you can kind of escape into Black music. You can escape in or resist by having Black art everywhere, wearing kind of African jewelry. And so you also see this allure of ethnic enclaves. And so ethnic enclaves could be sort of these spaces for dancing and music. It could be these spaces for shopping, being able to escape there and have a taste or appropriate a little bit of another culture as a way to kind of resist. And so here I have an image from a cover here of just sort of how in the 1920s and 30s, Blacks were depicted in this sort of very kind of offensive way, where the man who's just sort of wearing his tux and playing the piano, the sort of invisible piano, is sort of balancing this delicate white figure on his shoulder, and he's kind of this beastly character who's just very happy, just this wide-mouthed expression, which is a trope that we see in some of the decorative arts that come out, especially in the US and other countries as well. Just sort of the wide red mouth happening. Keep that in mind when we do our visual analysis exercise. And so when it comes to sort of embodying this sense of coolness and finding modernity on the backs of people who are oppressed, and that you're putting up this wall against these people to be citizens, to have a sense of belonging, to fit into fashion, and actually using them. I think of this recent article by Nick Grant. This was last September when he posted it to Fashionista, and it was entitled, "Is Fashion Relying Too Much on Hip Hop to Stay Relevant?" So he was writing about basically saying, again and again, when fashion, labels want to kind of draw upon something to embody coolness, or when maybe they're going through a period of trying to figure out their identity, you'll find them kind of drawing upon the styles of other cultures, and in this case, hip hop, and just sort of appropriating from it. And so we see this through the styles of dress. We see that through the artists like A$AP Rocky, who's become a muse for various fashion labels, where through the Black body, like through A$AP Rocky, or through these sort of signature styles like hip hop dress here from the early 80s, or through innovators like Dapper Dan in Harlem, creating these new ways of dressing the body, they are having trouble kind of penetrating the industry on their own, but then you'll have kind of these designers or businesses in power using them to stay relevant or to kind of harness the sense of coolness. Nancy Cunard, who was a kind of socialite and also featured in the book Negrophilia here, cropping her hair short like many of the women were doing in the 1920s, and was very much popularized by Josephine Baker. And here she's wearing all of her African bangles, and she dated a black man, and she was just very much sort of an ally at that time for all things black and cultural. Photographed by Cecil Beaton, also photographed by Cecil Beaton about a little over 10 years later, or just under 10 years later, you have a familiar face here, Gabrielle Coco Chanel, posing with these two black figures. Some more images here of what's happening. This time in the 1920s and 30s is rich for pulling from African culture, for better or for worse. So these are just some more images. This is a Vogue image here from 1927, featuring the influence of a really hot item during that time called the slave collar. In this, sorry for this little thing on top of the Life image. It was the best image I could find. But this is from Life magazine in July 1926, with this sort of flapper dancing around. And many of these dances were also pulled from Black American culture. And so the cover, what it was called is Everything is Hottentotsy Now. Kind of pulling from, again, our figure, Sarah Bartman, the Hottentot Venus. So everything's Hottentotsy now. So you have this woman kind of embracing modernity and coolness by doing these dances. And then you see these black figures, like a whole, almost like a wallpaper of black bodies in primitive form, kind of dancing, and the artist made sure to give them huge, wide red lips also. So they're dancing in this primitive nature, and then you have the embodiment of modernity, this white, blonde flapper model in all white dancing in front of them, front and center. One thing I didn't have time to add in here that I took out is a clip from a film with Joan Crawford in the early 1930s, where she does a dance scene and wears this little skimpy dress, where she is doing this dance that was popular in these ethnic enclaves around Harlem that all the black dancers were doing. She starts doing the dance in the film, and when she does this dance in the film, you see her friends are all sitting at these kind of cocktail tables, and they are just sort of in awe and grossed out, basically, when they see Joan Crawford doing this dance that the black women were popularly doing, like at the Cardin Club and popular dance spaces like that. And so what that also speaks to is that she's just sort of lost it. Now she's gone into this other culture, and she's been sort of consumed with this primitive spirit, because you see Joan Crawford dancing around, flinging her arms and legs about in this little dress and shaking her posterior and dancing around as the black women do. And they see it as, oh my God, just like, what is she doing? She's lost it. And so coming back to the slave collar, and so how we kind of use these items that have significant meaning when it comes to slavery, the enslavement of a group of people, and how we can take these items and turn it into fashionable adornments. We have the fashionable slave collar here. So here's some images. This is a historic image of just what a slave collar looks like. Just this collar around the neck and a chain to kind of keep these people together like animals and bound to their environment. And then you have it turned into a fashionable item with these two models here. Vogue magazine is right on top of it. So this is 1926. I found this spread showing all the hottest items from shoes to jewelry of what to wear. And I put a little red arrow up here to show that there's this image, this little kind of illustration of a man whipping a slave, and just so they can illustrate it that for you, this is Vogue magazine. And so they give the description here about the kind of item that you just must have. And it says, whatever their origin, slave bracelets like those shown just below are too intrinsically chic to be omitted. So you just have to have this item. Also, this is a little off topic from fashion, but this is happening in the media. This is still where you see these tropes. By the 1950s and then almost into the early 60s, you see this whole genre of voodoo thrillers where you see these the traits of Africanness or native primitiveness being this sort of boogeyman in these films. So you have these women like Kim Novak here in 1958, Bell Book and Candle, or Allison Hayes here in The Disembodied in 1957. Part of these voodoo thrillers is about this kind of white woman who's front and center, and she is either playing with or trying to run away from, or being consumed by this primitivity. And so you'll see these things featured in the background on set, like these sort of African masks, or you'll see animal skin rugs hanging around, things like that. Or the jewelry that you'll see here in Allison, she's wearing this sort of this animal print, and then these jewels and arm bracelets. So it's either the woman being consumed by this kind of darkness, or you see it something that you need to fear. Or in the case of sort of Kim Novak here, she's sort of like a witch character. So just keeping blackness or this sort of Africanness as this dark, lurking figure, this thing that is something to be feared. What this also adds to is this fear of contagion. So you don't want to come in contact with it too much, or you might be consumed and touched by it. And then just some more images here that persist in the 21st century, sort of whether it's blackamoor brooches or these sort of figures here, like these little figurines. Earrings here in Dolce & Gabbana's show from 2013, which created quite an outrage, especially when you have white models walking around with it. And so this kind of eases into cultural appropriation, which I just want to define for you quickly. So thinking about culture is a particular form or type of intellectual development. Also, the civilization, customs, artistic achievements of a group of people, or at a certain stage in its development. And then what is appropriation? Appropriation is the making of a thing private property, taking as one's own or to one's own use. And I pulled this from James O. Young's book, Cultural Appropriation in the Arts, which I use in my fashion and race class. So it's when members of one culture, let's just call them the outsider, they're taking for their own or for their own use items produced by a member or members of another culture, so say the insiders. The issue with cultural appropriation is about the power relations. So oftentimes when we're dealing with this, the outsiders are people who are enjoying privilege or enjoying power, and then the outsiders, or the people being appropriated, are the people who are not enjoying privilege or power, simply speaking. So again, speaking to what I talked about before the break, that precious asset of your style and the investment you're putting into it, this is why people get upset, when there's appropriation happening. So when you are putting this precious investment maybe into your braided hair, and you understand how much labor and thought is put into deciding to wear your hair braided in public spaces, and then to see, say, a designer take a group of white models and send them all down the runway in braided hair without a single black model there, that is when it feels like a violation, and where you feel that your identity has been appropriated. So again, appropriation becomes this ethical dilemma in the context of unequal power relations. Or as Dr. Ben Berry says and shares with me, who's sharing the power? So when we're doing this, when you see a culture or a group of people appropriated, it's about, how are we sharing the power relations? Are we going to share the profits from this? Or are you going to co-design this with me? Or are we just going to take your entire style? And so when I want to think about where we can situate cultural appropriation in the context of this conversation, where do we see this happen? And I just have a little list here at the bottom. This happens, or the key players who participate in this are designers, stylists. This is where the opportunity for cultural appropriation can happen. Models, editors, buyers, museum curators, photographers, shop and boutique owners. All of these players in the whole fashion system need to consider cultural appropriation. And there's 3 types of cultural appropriation that I pull from James Young's book. Object appropriation, so that's when like a tangible creative work is pulled from members of one culture to another. This could be on a small or large scale. This could be seeing all of the art that is in Egypt and saying, you know what, you guys don't really know how to take care of your things. We're gonna go ahead and take all these items and put it in a museum in the UK where we know how to take care of these things. Or we're gonna go to Thailand and take all of these things and put it in France because we know how to care for these things, and it would just be better there. And then there's style appropriation, the taking of stylistic elements of one culture into one's own creative work. So maybe you are a designer who is just having a moment where you're just fascinated by the clothing being done in Mexico right now. And so you decide to take certain items of their style, their collective or cultural style, and use it for your collection one year. And motif appropriation is related to style appropriation, and this is when there's only one select or basic motif brought into your creative work. And so the stylistic elements are used as an idea, but does not represent your entire oeuvre. So just to distinguish here, style and motif, the motif could be like, let's see if I have it here, like Isabel Marant having a moment where she decides to take this motif from Oaxacan women, but this doesn't represent her entire oeuvre. Like, this isn't all that Isabel Marant designs. She designs in various ways and has different collections that all look quite different. But one year, she wanted to design a blouse that was influenced by Oaxacan women. So this is motif appropriation, where she's just taking a style and she trademarked it as her own. And so you had Oaxacan women going up against Isabel Marant, arguing for ownership. And so these are some of the things that is happening right now. Also, when it comes to hair, again, what we were talking about before the break, hairstyling, when it becomes appropriated. Here's an example from backstage at a Marc Jacobs show. And so you have these models wearing these kind of tight top-knot buns. And then you have these magazine or fashion websites and magazines saying, we love this new top-knot hairstyle. It's completely new. And then you have many women coming out, or black women, saying, that's actually not new. Those are called Bantu knots, and they've been around for a couple centuries. Why are you renaming this or deciding that it's new or that it's cool now? So these are just other items of appropriation and the sort of the renaming of things. So if you want to put these sort of conversations into practice, and if you're concerned about whether or not you're appropriating, there's one great tip that I learned from Susan Scafidi. Susan Scafidi is the author of a book called Who Owns Culture, and she helped establish a fashion law institute at Fordham University in New York. So she's kind of blazing this trail for a new field called fashion law. Also, if you want to keep this in the back of your mind, any of you who are interested in social justice, lawmaking, issues with appropriation, copyright issues, you can actually get a degree at the Fashion Law Institute that kind of explores these things, that protects cultures or protects designers' creativity through the work that she's doing. And so she created the 3 S's, and that's what I'd like to share with you. One takeaway that you can kind of keep in your back pocket when it comes to cultural appropriation is Susan Scafidi's 3 S's. So those 3 S's are source, significance, and similarity. So the source, one thing when you're going shopping or you're deciding to put an outfit together or you see something from another culture that you're inspired by or you think looks cool, one question you can ask is, what is the source? Where does this item or style come from? Another thing, the second thing here is significance. Consider when you're looking at that thing, does the item or style hold sacred or political meaning? The third thing is similarity, the closeness in appearance or design. So this item here, this blouse from Isabel Marant, is quite similar to the genuine article. And so one thing to consider, though, when you're pulling from another person's culture, you're inspired, you have to think about the closeness and similarity. And if you decide to make changes, is that going to offend a certain culture? If you decide to alter the design or the appearance of something, is that offensive to a group of people? And then just some historical examples here. Pierre Cardin created in the 1960s and made quite a bit of money off of the Nehru jacket. He was inspired by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who would wear this long jacket. And then he made his own kind of alterations to it. He cut it shorter, he added 2 breast pockets, minimized the buttons, and it became a hit. And so he dressed the Beatles, like you see Paul McCartney here, in the Nehru jacket, and it just sort of took the fashion world by storm for at least a time. So it kind of helped with people who wanted to go against tradition or the status quo and wear a Nehru jacket to show how cultured you were or how well-traveled you were from a global perspective. So the Nehru jacket helped satisfy that and add a sense of coolness. Again, kind of speaking to what I was speaking about earlier, of just sort of how pulling from other cultures can add this sense of coolness. 2 other examples that happened in the 80s and 90s, Karl Lagerfeld getting in hot water in 1994 by taking text from the Quran that reads, "He whom God guides is well guided, and he who is abandoned by God will find no one to put him on the right road." He decided, just the script of it was beautiful, and he decided to put it on the bust of Claudia Schiffer and send it down the runway. And you had some pretty upset people, countries like Dubai or just different Arab markets threatening to pull out of dealing with Chanel, and you do not want to mess with these countries when it comes to your money. So they quickly had to destroy this garment, and he was apologizing for it. He honestly didn't see the harm in it. He just thought, I thought the text was beautiful, and I just wanted to put it on a dress. What's the big deal? And then another thing that happened here was Jean-Paul Gaultier's Rabbi Chic. This happens in the 90s. As Jean-Paul Gaultier tells it, he says, he was visiting New York. He says, "I saw a group of rabbis leaving the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue. I found them very beautiful, very elegant, with their hats and their huge cloaks flapping in the wind. It was a fantastic scene." And so that was the inspiration for his Chic Rabbis collection. And you can kind of look up the actual fashion show on YouTube, and he has the chanting and music playing, and he tries to create this whole scene of Rabbi Chic. This also was both well-received and angrily received. And it has all of our top models here just wearing it. Okay, so that's just kind of all I wanted to talk about with cultural appropriation and some of the inspirations that come from that. And so now I want to talk about the power of representation, taking you through a few visual analysis exercises here through cases. So when it comes to the power of representation, I have here just as an entry image some scenes from Beyonce's visual album Lemonade, where she tries to reclaim these garments that are just steeped in meaning, cultural significance. And so she tries to reclaim it by seeing power in wearing it on her own body. So like the hoodie or these dresses from African tradition. So before we go into our visual analysis exercise, thinking about these regimes of representation and what we see at play, these stereotypes, as Yomi Abiola told us in her TED Talk, of how, remember the photographer is just wanting, he's convulsing his body and wanting her to just sort of embrace or embody this stereotype that he thought all African women surely know how to tap into. And so this is how stereotypes work, and especially how they work in images that we're gonna see here. It essentializes a group of people. That's how race works, really, and what keeps it alive. It splits and excludes by fixing boundaries. You're black, you're black, you're black. You're not going to break through that boundary. Or this is who you are. And it facilitates ethnocentrism. And sometimes it involves fantasy and a misperception of reality. So again, creating this sort of fantasy, like through Yomi Abiola's body for the photographer, creating this fantasy of this wild, free, primitive black woman. And then also pathologizes as a regime strategy and creates a sort of symbolic violence upon the racialized body. So pathologizing and these human beings and seeing that this is who they are and this is who they always will be. And so also other regimes of power, these kind of power plays through the image, or the symbolic violence of misrepresenting an individual, can be sort of infantilizing or castrating the black body. We see this sort of normalized in images of violence or death through social media. It incenses me, you know, it's crazy that now through social media, it's almost become normalized or commonplace to see someone shot on your Facebook page or on Instagram. Someone captures a video and you just kind of shrug your shoulders and just think, another person died, or here's footage of people being assaulted, you know, and this is what's happening to the body. And so we become used to these images or these moving images. So representation is a concept and a practice. And this is a practice that we should also keep in mind when you're a photographer, when you're a designer, or if you're in business, when you're thinking about how someone is being represented, how many seats are at the table when it comes to power relations and how images will be used. So this process requires discourse and engagement. Again, thinking about who all is sitting at the table when we decide to put an image out there. Are we going to put out an image that is offensive or misrepresents? How many people of color do you have in your room? Or someone who is minoritized, who has something valuable to say that could stop an inappropriate image from being disseminated? And so I want to start with this image here. This isn't our case yet, but this image here from 1966 of the black model Danielle Luna. And she was on the cover of Vogue. And this is just sort of an entry exercise. And so if you just take in this image, David Bailey, popular photographer during this time, and this was a big deal. 1966, Vogue UK, having Danielle Luna on the cover. Looking at the way she's presented here on the cover, let's read into it for a minute. What are you seeing here? What are you seeing expressed through the lens and on the cover of this magazine? Danielle Luna, we decided to put this model here, and also notice her hair is straight. Though it's cropped, it's straight. So easing into having a black model on the cover here. We have her, as you stated, covering her face here. All you see peeking out is the eye, which can be interpreted as any kind of, it's very sort of, it could be sort of any race or nationality. You're not really sure. And any defining features or giveaways about that, as another person said. We see this where she's covering her nose or her lips to not reveal too much. So it's just peeking through here. So I thought it was incredible when I saw we have Edward Enfield take over British Vogue, and for his very first issue as the editor-in-chief, he uses Adwa Aboah here on the cover, and I thought it was uncanny, the two images. So I put them together in my fashion and race class this past fall, because that's when this happened, when he took over. And I just thought, I wonder if he knew this, if he knew that, I don't know if he meant to do this, but, when you put Danielle and Adwa together, it was just, it's this amazing moment where you see this model covering her face because we weren't ready yet. And now in 2017, we have a model that's saying, here I am, you see the full face here. All the way down to just sort of the position of the body, how much we're showing from the shoulders up, kind of vibrant eyes, also the dangling earrings. It's very similar. Also the patterned dresses that they're wearing. So I thought it was quite beautiful to see this sort of transition in the Vogue in UK, going from this one image of blackness to another. All of that is to say that representation matters. And so to close this up, because I know we're running out of time, those cases speak to exactly what you're saying. How does this happen? It is so important. It's imperative that we have people at the table making these decisions who understand history, historical context, sociocultural context, issues with race. So in closing, when it comes to the power of representation, I want to close with a montage of images of an exercise that I use as an intervention in representation in my fashion history classes. So between Pratt and Parsons, I teach fashion history, where each decade I'm taking you through the history of what we wore and why. And so I decided that after my lecture each week, I had my students, this is completely voluntary, the students could email me photos of their family members dressing during that respective time period. So if we're talking about the 1940s this week, email me in advance some photos of your family members. So each week after I do my lecture, then I pull up all the photos that you've sent me, and then I do a separate slideshow for like 10, 15 minutes where the students, I turn it to the students and they get to describe who this is on the screen. Like, this was my mother. This was my grandmother. She was a seamstress in Taiwan. This was my grandfather just before he came over from Turkey. So you end up with this full-bodied perspective of fashion history where you're not just learning about Dior, you're not just learning about Yves Saint Laurent, you're not just learning about Donna Karan. Students are learning about other students' histories and pasts. And together in the room, it's not just this one-sided perspective or this top-down perspective. It's everyone has a place in this narrative of fashion history, and together we are decentralizing fashion history. These are just some of the images that my students have sent me of their family members. One of the most prominent ones, we were talking about the 1950s, and she shared some images, and she says, this is a picture of when my grandparents met in an internment camp in Arkansas, where they were keeping Japanese Americans in a camp. And students were just silenced. Many of them didn't even know what an internment camp was and did not know that this was happening in US history, that they were gathering up Japanese people and putting them in these kind of camps for fear that they were against the US government. And so that's how they met. But she showed the resilience of her family members being fashionable, still smiling in spite of all of this. And so this is what it makes possible, these ways of expanding fashion history and what's going on in our everyday lives and giving power to the students. I want to thank all of you for hanging in there and participating and listening to this. So.
And Kim, on behalf of Fashion Concepts and Theory and Ryerson Fashion and the Center for Fashion Diversity and Social Change, everyone here, I really want to thank you for this really thoughtful, incredible tour. I think this really helps us think through race and how it's been socially constructed through fashion. And because you're the future of the fashion industry, keeping these conversations in mind is so, so important. And I think this is why in our design program, we want you to take fashion theory. We want you to take history. We want you to understand how identity's been constructed. So when you go to illustration, you go to apparel design, communication design, you're not repeating the same mistakes our industry continues to repeat, and instead you're designing for good, and you're designing to really authentically share voices and empower people. And today you've really taught us how to do just that. So thank you. Thank you for a brilliant lecture and for being here.